"Sit down, 27A. You're just a passenger, not a pilot." The shout echoed through the violently shaking cabin. Red lights flashing frantically, passengers gripping their armrests in terror. Some laughed mockingly. Who does she think she is? Some kind of hero? But when the co-pilot suddenly collapsed, when the plane lost all contact with air traffic control, when heavy silence pressed down like a suffocating blanket, the small blonde girl in the silk business suit stepped calmly into the cockpit, grabbed the radio microphone with steady hands, and whispered just 2 words, "Daybreak-Nine." Half a second of absolute dead silence. Then a gruff military voice crackled through the static. "Daybreak-Nine. Copy that." Every F-22 fighter jet in the sector simultaneously broke radio silence. The entire sky froze solid. Red-eye flight from Washington Dulles to Reykjavik. Thick cloud cover stretching endlessly below. Cabin filled to capacity with international businessmen, exchange students, vacationing families, and weary government contractors heading home. Seat 27A, Mara Elizabeth Lark, 30 years old, strikingly beautiful with long golden blonde hair pulled back in a professional chignon. She wore an expensive white silk blouse, charcoal gray pencil skirt, and black leather pumps. In her manicured hands rested a small, worn leather notebook, the kind pilots used to carry before everything went digital. To every passenger who glanced her way, she appeared to be nothing more than a high-level corporate executive traveling on business. Elegant, polished, completely disconnected from the complex machinery of flight that surrounded them 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. When the Boeing 777 hit severe turbulence over the Greenland ice sheet, many passengers began shifting nervously in their seats. A 6-year-old boy named Tommy in row 26 accidentally dropped his favorite toy, a small plastic F-16 fighter jet that his military father had given him. The toy clattered into the aisle. Without hesitation, Mara unbuckled her seatbelt, leaned down gracefully despite the aircraft's violent movements, picked up the toy plane, and placed it gently back into Tommy's small hands. She smiled warmly at him, the kind of smile that seemed to say everything would be okay. "Thank you, pretty lady," Tommy whispered, clutching his toy tighter. But Mara's attention had already shifted. Her ice-blue eyes were scanning the cabin ceiling, tracking the pattern of warning lights that most passengers hadn't even noticed. Her head tilted slightly, listening. A flight attendant named Rebecca rushed down the main aisle, speaking in urgent whispers into her handheld radio. Her face showed the kind of controlled panic that airline crew members were trained to hide from passengers. Something was definitely wrong. When Mara stood up to approach the flight attendant with a question, Rebecca immediately snapped at her in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately. You're just a passenger, not a pilot. We don't need your help." Several business-class passengers chuckled dismissively. A heavy-set man in an expensive Armani suit adjusted his gold Rolex and smirked. Probably one of those people who thinks watching Top Gun makes them an aviation expert. A middle-aged woman across the aisle rolled her eyes dramatically. She probably read some Wikipedia article about airplanes and now thinks she can fly the thing. More laughter rippled through the cabin. Someone whispered, "Maybe she's been playing too much Microsoft Flight Simulator." Mara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't argue back or defend herself. She simply returned to her seat in silence, her deep blue eyes now focused intently on the small window beside her. She was counting, measuring the rhythm of the navigation lights on the wingtip, timing the intervals between the flashes. The other passengers saw only what they expected to see, a beautiful but apparently delusional young woman who had watched too many Hollywood movies about aviation heroics. They had no way of knowing that her trained ears were picking up subtle variations in engine harmonics, the almost imperceptible changes in electrical frequency patterns that indicated serious trouble ahead. She opened her leather notebook, not to write anything new, but to reveal pages filled with radio frequencies, military call signs, and emergency protocols written in precise technical handwriting. Her fingers traced over faded ink. Memories of a different life. A life where her voice in a radio headset meant the difference between pilots coming home safely or never coming home at all. Passenger 28B, retired Air Force Master Sergeant James Chen, later told investigators, At first glance, she looked like any other corporate businesswoman. Expensive clothes, perfect makeup, nothing special. But when I saw her eyes during that turbulence, they had that 1,000-yard stare, like she was listening to radio frequencies the rest of us couldn't hear. I should have recognized it sooner. I'd seen that look on AWACS operators before. 2.5 hours into the transatlantic flight, as they crossed into Icelandic airspace, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Boeing 777 began experiencing violent oscillations. Not the random buffeting of normal turbulence, but the systematic, rhythmic shaking that indicated serious flight control problems. Emergency lighting bathed the cabin in pulsing red. Oxygen masks dangled from overhead compartments. Passengers were crying and praying in multiple languages. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Rodriguez and First Officer Sarah Kim were facing their worst nightmare. The transponder system had malfunctioned due to an intense electromagnetic storm, automatically switching to emergency code 7500, the international signal for aircraft hijacking. Every attempt to reset the system failed. Worse yet, their current flight path had drifted directly into restricted military airspace, the same corridor reserved for Air Force One and other classified government flights. Captain Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead as he tried desperately to establish radio contact with any air traffic control center. Reykjavik Control, this is United 847. We have a transponder malfunction. Request immediate vector change. Static, nothing but static. First Officer Kim's voice was tight with controlled fear. Captain, we're showing code 7500 on all frequencies. Military radar is going to light us up as a potential threat. The cabin erupted in panic as passengers felt the plane bank sharply to the left. Children screamed. Adults grabbed their loved ones. Flight attendants struggled to maintain order while secretly terrified themselves. The same businessman who had mocked Mara earlier was now gripping his armrest so hard his knuckles had turned white. He managed a nervous laugh. Hey, maybe that blonde girl in 27A really will save us all. Where's Wonder Woman when you need her? But Mara wasn't listening to the mockery anymore. She had opened her leather notebook to a specific page, a diagram showing military flight corridors over the North Atlantic. Cross-referencing their approximate position with the restricted airspace boundaries, she realized with growing alarm that they were flying directly through a zone reserved for high-priority government aircraft. She understood what the pilots apparently did not. In post-9/11 airspace protocols, any civilian aircraft squawking hijack codes in military corridors would be treated as a potential terrorist threat. Fighter jets would already be scrambling to intercept them. Standing up again, Mara moved quickly toward the front of the cabin. This time, 2 flight attendants moved to block her path. Ma'am, we've already told you, Rebecca began. No entry to the cockpit under any circumstances, finished her colleague, Marcus, a tall man who had been with the airline for 15 years. Passengers started shouting their opinions. Let the pilots do their job. She's just making everything worse. Security! Someone stop her. What does some office worker think she can do? But when the aircraft suddenly pitched forward at a terrifying angle, when the screaming reached a crescendo, when little Tommy started crying for his daddy, Mara's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Listen to me very carefully. If this transponder malfunction isn't corrected in the next 60 seconds, F-22 Raptors will intercept this aircraft and force us to land or shoot us down. I know because I used to be the voice that guided those pilots. Give me 30 seconds in that cockpit or we're all gonna die. Her tone was so calm, so absolutely certain, so completely different from the shy businesswoman they had dismissed, that everyone fell silent. The cockpit door opened. Captain Rodriguez turned around, his face haggard with stress. Miss, I appreciate your concern, but switch to VHF emergency frequency 121.5, Mara interrupted, stepping behind the pilot seats without asking permission. Your VHF-1 radio is picking up storm interference. Try VHF-2. No, that's not going to work either. Use VHF-3 and compensate for atmospheric drift. Add 100 kilohertz to your base frequency. Captain Rodriguez stared at her in bewilderment. How do you possibly know? Because I used to sit in that exact seat, she said quietly. pointing to the first officer's chair. Every single day for 3 years. AWACS call sign, Daybreak-Nine. Electronic Warfare Specialist. I've guided more fighter intercepts than you've flown commercial routes. She reached for the radio microphone with the confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her voice when she spoke into the microphone was completely different from the polite passenger voice they had heard earlier. This was the voice of military authority. Daybreak-Nine calling any military frequency, handshake protocol, glass lantern clearance, authentication query requested. The radio fell completely silent. Even the static disappeared. In the passenger cabin behind them, 300 people held their breath. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. 15. Then cutting through the silence like thunder, a gravelly voice responded, Daybreak-Nine. This is Raptor Lead. Copy your transmission. Authentication November Echo 7 Foxtrot. Mara's response was immediate and precise. Echo 7 Foxtrot Tango Whiskey Charlie. Civilian aircraft United 847. Souls on board 312. Transponder malfunction causing false hijack signal. Requesting safe corridor to Reykjavik. Authentication confirmed. Daybreak-Nine. Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. Stand by for escort instructions. On the radar screen, 2 bright contacts appeared out of nowhere. F-22 Raptor stealth fighters that had been invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. The lead aircraft waggled its wings. The universal signal for follow me. Through the cockpit radio, fragments of military communication could be heard. Raptor lead to control. Daybreak-Nine is active on frequency. Control copies, but that call sign was retired 3 years ago. Negative control, voice authentication positive. She's real, and she just saved a civilian airliner. The passenger cabin had fallen into stunned, reverent silence. Even the crying children had stopped. Everyone realized they had just witnessed something impossible. A moment when the ordinary world had suddenly opened up to reveal hidden depths of training, skill, and courage that they never could have imagined. Rebecca Martinez, head flight attendant, wrote in her official incident report, I initially dismissed her as just another passenger with delusions of grandeur. But when I heard that radio exchange, when I saw those fighter jets appear on our radar, I realized we had just been saved by someone who commanded respect from the most elite pilots in the United States Air Force. The way she spoke into that microphone, it was like watching Clark Kent transform into Superman. Within minutes of Mara's radio transmission, encrypted messages began flowing through military communication networks across 3 continents. Flash, priority, daybreak, 9 confirmed alive and active. All stations, former AWACS operator, Mara Elizabeth Lark, call sign Daybreak-9 has resumed contact after 3-year absence. Eyes only. The ghost is back on frequency. For Mara had not simply been any military radio operator. She had been part of an elite E-3 century AWACS crew, the airborne early warning and control aircraft that served as the nerve center for complex air operations. Her specific specialty had been electronic warfare and frequency interference resolution, the art of maintaining clear communications when enemy forces tried to jam military frequencies. Her legendary status came from a single mission over Syria 3 years earlier, when an entire squadron of F-16 had been caught in an electronic warfare ambush, their radios jammed and GPS systems spoofed. Mara had been the voice that guided them home through a maze of surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighters. Using nothing but backup frequencies and pure radio triangulation, she had talked 12 pilots safely back to base, while enemy forces tried desperately to break her communications. But that same mission had ended in tragedy. During a routine aerial refueling operation, her closest friend and fellow AWACS operator, Technical Sergeant Lisa Wong, had been killed when their aircraft experienced sudden decompression. Mara had blamed herself, convinced that she should have detected the mechanical failure sooner, should have warned the crew in time. Unable to cope with the guilt, she had resigned her commission and disappeared into civilian life, taking a job as a financial analyst for a consulting firm in Washington. She had hidden her military background so completely that even her closest civilian friends had no idea she had ever served. But now, 37,000 feet above the North Atlantic, fate had pulled her back into the world she had tried so hard to leave behind. The F-22 pilot's voice crackled through the radio again. Daybreak-Nine, this is Raptor Lead, Colonel Jake Morrison. Your corridor is glass. Repeat, your corridor is glass. We'll escort you all the way to Reykjavik. It's damn good to have you back on frequency. Mara keyed the microphone. Roger, glass corridor, Raptor Lead. Appreciate the escort. Civilian crew is handling aircraft control. I'm just providing communication support. Copy that, Daybreak-Nine. For what it's worth, Lisa would be proud of what you just did. The mention of her dead friend's name hit Mara like a physical blow. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the microphone. Captain Rodriguez noticed her reaction. You okay, miss? Just old ghosts, she whispered. Let me help you establish proper contact with Reykjavik approach control. For the next 20 minutes, Mara guided the civilian crew through a series of radio procedures that gradually restored normal communication with air traffic control. She explained to Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Kim exactly what had happened. The electromagnetic storm created a cascade failure in your transponder system. In military airspace, that automatically triggered terrorist threat protocols. Those F-22s were already airborne and had weapons hot when I made contact. If we hadn't authenticated within another 30 seconds, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the cockpit understood. As the aircraft stabilized and normal flight operations resumed, word of what had happened began spreading through the passenger cabin. The flight attendants, no longer able to contain their amazement, quietly shared the story with passengers who asked what had occurred. The businessman who had mocked Mara earlier approached her seat with tears in his eyes. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I owe you my life. We all do. But Mara was no longer the confident military voice they had heard on the radio. She had retreated back into her civilian persona, the shy businesswoman who just wanted to blend into the background. You don't owe me anything, she said softly. I just happen to know the right frequencies to call. An elderly man in row 15 stood up slowly. He was wearing a faded baseball cap with USS Enterprise CVN-65 embroidered on it. Clearly a military veteran. He looked directly at Mara and rendered a perfect military salute. Ma'am, Petty Officer First Class David Chen, United States Navy, retired. Thank you for your service, and thank you for bringing us home. Other veterans on the aircraft began to recognize what had happened. A retired Army colonel, a former Marine sergeant, a Coast Guard veteran. One by one, they stood and saluted the young woman who had saved their lives. Little Tommy, still clutching his toy airplane, wiggled out of his mother's arms and ran to Mara's seat. Lady, are you really a pilot like my daddy? Mara knelt down to his level, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I used to help pilots, and sweetie. But the most important thing isn't being a pilot. It's knowing when to help and knowing when to let others do their job. My daddy flies fighter jets, Tommy said proudly. Maybe he knows you. Maybe he does, Mara smiled. What's his name? Captain Tommy Rodriguez. But everyone calls him Mustang. Mara's breath caught. She knew that call sign. Mustang had been one of the F-16 pilots she had guided home during that mission over Syria. One of the 12 men whose lives she had saved on the day Lisa died. Tell your daddy that Daybreak-Nine says hello, she whispered. As the aircraft began its descent toward Reykjavik, Captain Rodriguez came out of the cockpit personally to thank her. Ma'am, I've been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years. I've never seen anything like what you did today. Would you be willing to help us document the emergency procedures you used? This could save lives in future incidents. Mara nodded and wrote 3 brief lines in his logbook. Precise technical instructions for handling transponder malfunctions in military airspace. She didn't sign her name. When they touched down at Keflavik International Airport, there was no applause. Only solemn, respectful silence. Every passenger understood that they had been part of something extraordinary. Something that would change their understanding of heroism forever. As passengers began deplaning at Reykjavik, word of the incident had already begun spreading through aviation networks worldwide. Air traffic controllers were quietly sharing the story. Military personnel were checking classified databases. Aviation enthusiasts on social media were trying to piece together fragmentary reports of a mysterious radio transmission that had prevented a potential air disaster. but the official record would show nothing unusual. The airline's incident report listed only minor transponder malfunction resolved in flight. The Icelandic aviation authorities noted routine military escort due to communication difficulties. The Pentagon classified all radio recordings under national security protocols. Captain Rodriguez personally escorted Mara through the airport, hoping to convince her to speak with airline safety investigators. "Miss Lark, what you did today, it's going to change how we train pilots to handle these situations. You could save thousands of lives by sharing your knowledge." But Mara had already begun the process of disappearing back into anonymity. She had changed into casual clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a simple sweater. Her blonde hair was now in a simple ponytail. Without her business suit and professional demeanor, she looked like any other tourist. "Captain, you and your crew handled everything perfectly once you had proper communication. You don't need me to teach you how to fly." "But the radio procedures, the military frequencies, how did you know exactly which?" Anyone with the right training would have done the same thing. She handed him a business card for her consulting firm. "If airline safety investigators want to discuss transponder malfunction protocols, they can reach me through my office." As they walked through the terminal, several passengers approached her. The elderly Navy veteran shook her hand firmly. "Ma'am, my granddaughter is joining the Air Force next year. I'm going to tell her about what you did today." The businessman who had mocked her earlier tried to offer her his business card, clearly hoping to somehow repay her or perhaps benefit from knowing someone with her capabilities. She politely declined. Little Tommy ran up to her one final time, carrying his toy airplane. In careful crayon letters, someone had written "Daybreak" on the side of the plastic F-16. "I named him after you," Tommy announced proudly. Mara knelt down and hugged the little boy gently. "Remember what I told you, Tommy. Don't fly to be famous. Fly to bring people home safely, just like your daddy does." She handed him back the toy and walked away before anyone could see the tears in her eyes. But her impact was only beginning to spread. Within hours, encrypted messages were flowing through military communication channels. The flight attendant who had initially dismissed her, Rebecca Martinez, wrote a detailed memo to airline management. "We need comprehensive training for flight crew on recognizing when passengers might have relevant emergency expertise." What if she hadn't been brave enough to speak up? What if she had listened to us and stayed in her seat? The veteran passenger, David Chen, submitted a report through Veterans Affairs channels. Daybreak-Nine maintained perfect operational security while saving civilian lives. Her conduct exemplified the highest traditions of military service. The Department of Defense should consider recalling her to active duty. Colonel Jake Morrison, the F-22 pilot who had escorted the aircraft, filed his own classified report. Former AWACS operator Lark demonstrated textbook communication protocols under extreme pressure. Recommend immediate security clearance review for potential return to service. 3 days later, a package arrived at Mara's apartment in Washington. Inside was Tommy's toy airplane, carefully wrapped, along with a handwritten note. "Dear Daybreak Lady, Mommy helped me send this to you. I want you to have it because you are a real hero like my daddy. The man in the airport told me your real name is Daybreak-Nine and that you save pilots in the sky. I hope you save my daddy someday if he needs help. Love, Tommy Rodriguez." P.S. Daddy says he remembers you from the desert and you saved his whole squadron. He says thank you. Mara placed the toy airplane on her windowsill, where the morning sunlight made the plastic wings seem to glow. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to guide pilots safely home. That evening, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Pentagon number. "Miss Lark, this is General Patricia Hayes, commander of the 552nd Air Control Wing. I believe we need to talk." Mara looked at the toy airplane on her windowsill, at her old leather notebook sitting on the coffee table, at the business cards from grateful passengers she would probably never see again. "General, with all due respect, I'm retired. Miss Lark, we have pilots flying combat missions right now who need the best communication support available. After what happened today, I think we both know where you belong." Mara was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of civilian aircraft passing overhead on their approach to Reagan National Airport. Finally, she spoke. I'll need to give my consulting firm 2 weeks' notice. If you believe a calm voice can hold the sky together, type Daybreak Lives. 6 months later, official records still showed nothing unusual about United Flight 847's journey from Washington to Reykjavik. The airline's safety database listed only routine communication procedures and standard military escort protocols. Aviation authorities filed the incident under equipment malfunction, resolved without emergency landing. But for the 312 passengers who were aboard that aircraft, the memory remained crystal clear. They had witnessed something that challenged every assumption they had ever made about heroism, expertise, and the power of hidden knowledge. Some of them would tell the story for years to come. Others would carry it quietly, like a secret that was almost too profound to share. All of them had learned the same lesson. Never judge someone by their appearance, because behind the most ordinary exterior might lie extraordinary capabilities. Mara Lark was now sitting in a very different aircraft, an E-3 Century AWACS plane 30,000 feet above the Mediterranean Sea. She was wearing a military flight suit again, her blonde hair pulled back in regulation style, speaking into a headset microphone with the calm authority that had never really left her. Falcon Squadron, this is Daybreak-Nine. Your flight path is clear. Bandits eliminated. Safe to continue mission. Copy that, Daybreak-Nine. Thanks for keeping us alive up here. Just doing my job, Falcon Lead. Bring everyone home safe. On her desk in the AWACS command center sat a small plastic F-16 fighter jet with Daybreak written in crayon on the side. Tommy's gift served as a daily reminder of why she had returned to military service. Not for glory or recognition, but for the simple, powerful purpose of bringing people home safely. General Hayes had been right, of course. The military needed her expertise now more than ever. Electronic warfare had become increasingly sophisticated. Enemy forces were constantly developing new ways to jam communications, spoof GPS signals, and isolate aircraft from ground control. Mara's unique combination of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding of radio frequency behavior made her invaluable. But she had insisted on one condition: complete anonymity. No media interviews, no public recognition, no ceremony. She would serve again, but only as a voice in the darkness. A guardian angel that pilots could call when everything else failed. Sometimes late at night during long-range missions, she would think about the passengers from that United flight. The businessman was probably telling the story at cocktail parties, embellishing it a little more each time. The veteran passengers had likely shared it with their families, adding it to the collection of military stories that get passed down through generations. Little Tommy would be 7 years old now, probably still playing with airplanes and dreaming of following in his father's footsteps. His father, Captain Mustang Rodriguez, had indeed remembered her from that mission over Syria and had sent her a letter of gratitude through official military channels. Rebecca Martinez, the flight attendant, had been promoted to training supervisor and was now teaching new crew members to recognize when passengers might have valuable emergency expertise. Her training program had already prevented 2 potential incidents where knowledgeable passengers had been able to assist crews with technical problems. The consulting firm where Mara had worked as a financial analyst had been puzzled by her sudden departure, but they had accepted her explanation of new opportunities in government service. Her former colleagues probably assumed she had taken a boring desk job somewhere in the federal bureaucracy. If any of them could see her now, sitting in the command center of one of the world's most sophisticated military aircraft, coordinating complex air operations across multiple time zones, her voice serving as the lifeline for pilots facing combat situations, they would hardly recognize the quiet woman who had once analyzed investment portfolios in a glass office building. But Mara preferred it that way. Heroes, she had learned, were not people who sought recognition. They were people who stepped forward when needed, who used their skills when lives were at stake, and who disappeared back into anonymity when the crisis passed. As her shift ended and she prepared to return to base, Mara opened her old leather notebook and wrote a single line. Today's lesson: don't fly to be remembered. Fly to help others forget they were ever in danger. Then she closed the notebook, smiled at Tommy's toy airplane, and prepared for another night of bringing pilots safely home from the darkness. If you believe in stories like this, if you believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it, Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe to SN Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people creating and sharing real stories, not mass-produced AI content.